The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the apartment door while Sarah Martinez was still asleep. When she finally stumbled out of bed at 6:30, groggy from another restless night, she nearly stepped on it. The envelope was thin and official-looking, the kind that usually meant bad news. Bills, overdue notices, or worse, another letter from her ex-husband's lawyer, demanding something she couldn't give. She picked it up with trembling fingers, her heart already sinking. The return address read, Whitmore Associates, estate attorneys. Sarah stood in the narrow hallway of her cramped two-bedroom apartment, the morning light barely filtering through the dusty blinds, and felt the familiar weight of dread settle over her shoulders. Inside, the letter was brief, formal, coldly professional. Dear Ms. Martinez, we are writing to inform you that you have been named in the estate distribution of Harold Vincent Martinez, deceased. As per his final wishes, a property asset has been designated to you. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the transfer details. Sarah read it 3 times before the words began to make sense. Harold Vincent Martinez, her grandfather, the man she'd met exactly twice in her life, both times before she turned 10. The man who had disowned her mother for marrying the wrong person, who had refused to acknowledge Sarah's existence, who had died 3 months ago without a single member of the family attending his funeral. And now, apparently, he'd left her something. She sat down heavily on the worn couch, the springs groaning beneath her weight. Her daughter, Emma, was still asleep in the bedroom they shared, curled beneath a patchwork quilt Sarah had sewn from old clothes. The apartment smelled faintly of last night's dinner, instant ramen mixed with canned vegetables. The refrigerator hummed loudly in the corner, a sound Sarah had learned to tune out months ago. The notice from the landlord was still taped to the wall beside the door. 60 days to vacate or pay the 3 months of back rent she owed. $2,400 that might as well have been $2 million. She'd been working double shifts at the diner, picking up weekend cleaning jobs, selling everything she could spare. But it was never enough. It was never, ever enough. Her phone buzzed. A text from her manager. Can you cover lunch shift today? Maria called in sick. Sarah closed her eyes. She'd already worked the breakfast shift yesterday and the dinner shift the night before. Her feet still ached, but she typed back anyway. Yes, I'll be there. She looked at the letter again. Estate distribution. Property asset. The words felt like a cruel joke. What could her grandfather possibly have left her? The man who had made it clear she was nothing to him? Probably some broken-down shed on worthless land, a final insult from beyond the grave. Still, she called the number on the letterhead during her break at work, standing outside the diner in the cold November wind, her thin jacket doing almost nothing against the chill. The receptionist who answered was polite, but distant. Mr. Whitmore can see you this Friday at 2 o'clock. Please bring identification and any relevant family documentation. Friday. That was 3 days away. Now 3 days of wondering, of hoping despite herself, of trying not to imagine that maybe, just maybe, something good was finally coming her way. When she picked up Emma from school that afternoon, her daughter's teacher pulled her aside. Mrs. Chen was a kind woman with graying hair and soft eyes that always seemed to carry a hint of pity when she looked at Sarah. Emma's been doing so well, Mrs. Chen said gently. But I wanted to mention that the class trip next month requires a $20 fee. I know things have been difficult, so if you need more time, I'll have it. Sarah interrupted quickly, her cheeks burning. Thank you. Emma chatted excitedly on the walk home, her small hand warm in Sarah's. She talked about the art project they'd started in class, about her friend Madison's new puppy, about the story they'd read during reading time. Sarah listened, smiling and nodding, but her mind was elsewhere. On the letter. On the appointment. on the impossible hope that was already taking root despite her best efforts to kill it. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at the tiny kitchen table and looked up Harold Martinez online. The obituary was brief. Harold Vincent Martinez, 87, of Greenfield, passed away peacefully on August 15th. A longtime resident and businessman, he is survived by distant relatives. No services per his request. Businessman. The word felt hollow. Sarah's mother had told her stories once, before she'd stopped talking about her father entirely. Harold had owned property, had made his money in real estate during the boom years. He'd built an empire on other people's misfortunes, buying foreclosed homes and abandoned buildings, turning them for profit. He'd been ruthless, her mother said. Cold. A man who measured worth in dollars and cents. And now he'd left Sarah something. But what? Friday came slowly. Sarah borrowed a blazer from her neighbor, the only person in the building who still spoke to her with anything resembling warmth. She dropped Emma at school early, took 2 buses across town, and arrived at the law office with 10 minutes to spare. The building was old, but well-maintained, the kind of place that spoke of quiet money and long-established reputations. The receptionist directed her to a small conference room where Mr. Whitmore sat waiting, a thin man in his 60s, with silver hair and tired eyes. "Ms. Martinez," he said, rising to shake her hand. His grip was firm but brief. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." Sarah sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mr. Whitmore opened a folder on the table, scanning the contents with practiced efficiency. "Your grandfather's estate was complex," he began. "The bulk of his assets were distributed to various charities and business partners. However, he specifically designated one property to be transferred to you, his only grandchild." Sarah's throat felt tight. "What property?" Mr. Whitmore pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. Sarah's breath caught. It was a fire station, or what had been a fire station once. The building was massive, 3 stories of red brick, with tall arched windows and a bell tower that leaned slightly to one side. But it was also clearly abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the brick crumbling in places, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. Graffiti covered the lower walls, and weeds grew thick around the foundation. "This is station number 9, Mr. Whitmore continued, his voice neutral. "Built in 1889, decommissioned in 1963. It's been vacant for over 40 years. Your grandfather purchased it in a tax sale 15 years ago for, according to records, $1. $1. Sarah stared at the photograph. The building looked like it was barely standing. "Why would he leave me this?" Mr. Whitmore's expression didn't change. "I couldn't say." Mr. Martinez left no explanation, only instructions that the property be transferred to you in full, free of liens or encumbrances. The deed will be yours as soon as you sign the transfer documents. "What's it worth?" Sarah asked quietly. She already knew the answer. She could see it in the photograph, in the decay and ruin. But she had to ask. "The city assessor values the land at approximately $8,000, Mr. Whitmore said. However, the building itself is in severe disrepair. It would likely cost more to demolish than it's worth. I should also inform you that the structure has been cited multiple times for safety violations. If you accept the transfer, those citations become your responsibility." Sarah felt something inside her crack. Of course this was what her grandfather had left her. Not help, not rescue, but a burden. One final way to remind her that she was nothing, that she deserved nothing but the scraps no one else wanted. "What happens if I refuse it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The property reverts to the estate and will be auctioned to cover administrative costs," Mr. Whitmore said. "But Ms. Martinez, I should mention that there are no outstanding taxes. The building is structurally unsound, yes, but the land beneath it is free and clear. Some people in your situation might see value in that. Sarah looked at the photograph again. The fire station loomed in the image, a ghost of something that had once been important, useful, vital. Now it was just another ruin in a city full of them. She thought of Emma, of the eviction notice, of the $20 field trip fee she couldn't afford, of the years stretching ahead of her, each one harder than the last, fighting and scraping and failing to give her daughter the life she deserved. What did she have to lose? "I'll take it," she said. Mr. Whitmore raised an eyebrow slightly, the first crack in his professional demeanor. "Are you certain? The building requires significant work. The costs." "I'll take it," Sarah repeated, more firmly this time. "Where do I sign?" 20 minutes later, she walked out of the office with a folder of documents and a key ring that held 3 tarnished brass keys. The deed to station number 9 was in her name. Sarah Elena Martinez, sole owner of a condemned building in the oldest part of the city. She should have felt something. Relief, maybe. Or dread. But instead, she just felt numb. Her sister called that evening. Laura had always been the practical one, the one who'd gone to college, married well, moved to the suburbs. They spoke maybe twice a year, usually around holidays. "Mom told me about the inheritance," Laura said, her voice tight with disapproval. "A fire station? Sarah, what were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking," Sarah admitted. I don't know. Maybe I can sell the land." "No one's going to buy that property," Laura said flatly. "It's in the worst part of town. The building's a death trap. You should have refused it." "I couldn't refuse it." "Why not?" Sarah closed her eyes. "Because it was the only thing anyone has ever given me. Because I'm desperate. Because I thought maybe, just maybe, there was something there worth having." But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she said simply, "I have to go. Emma needs help with her homework." "Sarah." She hung up before her sister could finish. The weekend came. Sarah borrowed her neighbor's car, promising to fill the tank, and drove across the city to see the property. Emma came with her, bouncing excitedly in the passenger seat, so asking 100 questions about fire stations and firefighters, and whether they'd find any old fire trucks inside. "Probably not, sweetheart," Sarah said gently. "The building's been empty a long time." They drove through neighborhoods that grew progressively older, the buildings more run down, the streets narrower. This part of the city had been forgotten decades ago, left to decay, while newer developments sprawled outward. The few people on the sidewalks moved with the weary shuffle of those who had nowhere else to go. Finally, Sarah turned onto Ashland Street and stopped. Station number 9 stood at the corner, even larger in person than in the photograph. The red brick was dark with age and soot, the mortar crumbling between the stones. The bell tower rose against the gray November sky, its copper roof green with oxidation. One of the massive garage doors hung at an angle, the wood splintered and rotting. The other was sealed with rusted metal panels. Emma's excitement faded. "It looks scary," she said quietly. "It's just old," Sarah said, trying to sound confident. "Come on, let's look around." They got out of the car. The street was empty, silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Sarah approached the front door, which stood beneath a stone arch, carved with the words, "Greenfield Fire Department, Station Number 9 to 1889. The door itself was metal, painted red long ago, but now flaking and rusted. She tried the first key. It didn't fit. The second one slid into the lock, but wouldn't turn. The third key, smaller and more ornate than the others, turned with a grinding screech. The door swung inward, hinges shrieking. A wave of stale air rolled out, carrying the smell of mold, dust, and something else, something faintly metallic, like old coins. Sarah pulled out her phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped inside. The interior was dark, the boarded windows allowing only thin strips of gray light to filter through. As her eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. They were standing in what had been the apparatus bay, a vast open space with a ceiling that soared 2 stories overhead. The concrete floor was cracked and stained, littered with debris, broken glass, chunks of plaster, pieces of rotted wood. Against the far wall, covered in dust and cobwebs, sat the remnants of what might have once been workbenches or storage lockers. Graffiti covered the walls, layers upon layers of spray paint, forming a chaotic collage of names, symbols, and profanity. "Mom, I don't like it here," Emma whispered, pressing close to Sarah's side. "It's okay," Sarah said, though her own unease was growing. "We're just looking. We won't stay long." They moved deeper into the building. A metal staircase, treads rusted through in places, led to the 2nd floor. Sarah tested it carefully, then climbed, each step groaning under her weight. Emma stayed close behind. The 2nd floor had been living quarters once. Sarah could see the layout. Small rooms along a central hallway, each one barely larger than a closet. Bunk rooms for the firefighters. Most of the doors were missing, and the rooms themselves were empty shells. Plaster had fallen from the ceiling in sheets, exposing the wooden lath beneath. Pipes hung loose from the walls, dripping rust-colored water onto the floor. In one room, someone had left an old mattress, now rotted and covered in mold. In another, broken bottles littered the floor. The smell of decay was stronger here, mixing with something else. The acrid scent of old smoke, as if the building itself remembered the fires it had been built to fight. "This place is falling apart," Sarah murmured. She'd known the building was in bad shape, but seeing it in person, feeling the rot and neglect in every surface, made the reality hit harder. This wasn't a property. It was a liability. They reached the end of the hallway. A final staircase, narrower than the first, led upward to the 3rd floor and the bell tower. The steps here were wood, and several were missing entirely, leaving dark gaps that dropped straight down to the floor below. "We're not going up there," Sarah said firmly. "No, it's not safe." As they turned to leave, something caught her eye. At the base of the tower stairs, partially hidden behind a collapsed section of ceiling, was a door. It was small, almost child-sized, and made of heavy dark wood that looked much older than the rest of the building. Unlike everything else in the station, this door appeared intact, undamaged by time or vandals. Sarah stepped closer, pulling aside chunks of plaster. The door had no handle, only a keyhole carved directly into the wood. Strange symbols were etched around the frame, not graffiti, but something older, more deliberate. They looked almost like letters, but in a language Sarah didn't recognize. She tried the ornate brass key, the same one that had opened the front door. It slid into the lock perfectly. But when she turned it, nothing happened. The door remained sealed, as if it were part of the wall itself. "Maybe it's just painted shut," Emma suggested. "Maybe," Sarah said, but she wasn't convinced. She pushed against the wood, then pulled. Nothing. The door didn't budge even a fraction of an inch. Emma tugged on her sleeve. "Can we go now?" "Please?" Sarah nodded, taking one last look at the strange door before turning away. They made their way back through the building, past the empty rooms and graffiti-covered walls, back down to the apparatus bay and out into the cold afternoon air. As Sarah locked the front door behind them, she turned to look up at the building one more time. 3 stories of history and decay, a monument to something that no longer existed. And somewhere inside, a door that wouldn't open. "What are you going to do with it?" Emma asked as they walked back to the car. Sarah didn't have an answer. She couldn't sell it. Laura was right about that. No one would buy a condemned building in this part of town. She couldn't afford to renovate it. She could barely afford to feed them. The smartest thing would be to walk away, let the city take it, forget she'd ever been foolish enough to accept it. But as they drove away, Sarah found herself looking in the rearview mirror, watching the fire station grow smaller until it disappeared around a corner. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the building was watching her too, waiting to see what she would do next. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, searching for information about station number 9. There wasn't much. Well, a few historical society pages mentioned it briefly. One of the oldest fire stations in the city, built during the expansion of the 1880s, decommissioned when newer facilities opened in the surrounding neighborhoods. It had been abandoned since then, changing hands through tax sales and estate transfers, never staying with one owner for long. But one detail caught her attention. A newspaper article from 1962, the year before the station closed, mentioned a small controversy. The fire chief at the time had reported several firefighters claiming the building was not structurally sound and requesting a transfer to other stations. The city had investigated, found nothing wrong, and the matter was dropped. 6 months later, the station was closed for unrelated budgetary reasons. Not structurally sound. The same phrase Mr. Whitmore had used. Sarah frowned, scrolling through more search results. Most were dead ends, but finally she found something else. A blog post from a local urban explorer who had broken into the building 5 years earlier. The post included photos, blurry shots of the apparatus bay and the second-floor hallway that matched what Sarah had seen. But at the end, the blogger had written something strange. "There's a sealed room on the second floor. We tried to get in but couldn't. The door's solid, way more solid than anything else in that wreck. Whatever's behind it, someone really didn't want anyone finding it. Gave me the creeps, so we left. Probably just old storage, but still weird." A sealed room. Sarah thought of the small door she'd found, the one that wouldn't open despite the key fitting perfectly. Had the blogger been talking about the same door? Or was there another sealed space somewhere in the building? She closed the laptop, exhaustion finally overwhelming her curiosity. Tomorrow she had the breakfast shift again. Then she needed to call the city about the safety violations, figure out what the minimum requirements were to avoid fines she couldn't pay. But as she lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of her apartment, Sarah's mind kept circling back to that door, to the strange symbols carved around its frame, to the fact that it had remained sealed and intact while everything around it fell apart. What was behind it? And why did she care so much? The answer came a week later, though not in the way she expected. Sarah was working the lunch shift when a man walked into the diner, older, maybe in his 70s, with white hair and sharp blue eyes. He sat at the counter, had ordered coffee, and watched her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Finally, during a lull in the rush, he spoke. "You're Sarah Martinez." It wasn't a question. Sarah paused, coffee pot in hand. "Do I know you?" "No," he said, "but I knew your grandfather." Sarah's grip tightened on the pot. "I didn't really know him." "I'm aware." The man pulled out a business card and slid it across the counter. "My name is Marcus Webb. I was your grandfather's accountant for 30 years. I heard you inherited the fire station." "How did you—" "Small city," Marcus interrupted. "Lawyers talk. I wanted to speak with you before you did something foolish with that property." Sarah bristled. "Like what? Like selling it for scrap or tearing it down?" His eyes were steady, unblinking. "That building is more valuable than you realize. The assessor says—" "The assessor doesn't know everything." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Your grandfather bought that station because he believed there was something inside worth finding. He spent years researching it, but he never got around to actually searching the building before he died. If I'm right, and if he was right, There's something in that old fire station that could change your life." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean? What kind of something?" Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's what you need to discover. But I'd advise you not to mention this conversation to anyone, including that lawyer. Especially that lawyer." He stood, left a $5 bill on the counter for the coffee, and walked out before Sarah could ask anything else. She found the business card in her apron pocket an hour later. Marcus Webb, CPA, a phone number, and handwritten on the back, 3 words that made her pulse race. Check the tower. That weekend, against her better judgment, Sarah returned to station number 9. This time she came alone, leaving Emma with her neighbor. She brought better flashlights, work gloves, and a crowbar she'd borrowed from the building superintendent. The front door groaned open. Sarah stepped into the apparatus bay, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The building felt different now, less like a ruin and more like a puzzle. Marcus Webb's words echoed in her mind. Something valuable. Something worth finding. She climbed to the 2nd floor, then stood at the base of the tower stairs, staring up at the dark passage above. The wooden steps looked even more treacherous than she remembered, gaps yawning between them like missing teeth. "Check the tower," she whispered. Slowly, carefully, Sarah began to climb. The wood creaked and shifted under her weight. Twice she had to jump across gaps where steps had rotted away completely. Her heart hammered in her chest, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold. Finally, she reached the top. The bell tower was a small, square room with windows on all 4 sides, most of the glass long shattered. The massive bronze bell still hung from its mount in the center, green with age. Pigeon droppings covered the floor, and the smell was overwhelming. Sarah swept her flashlight around the space. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the bell, the windows, the rotting floorboards. But then her light caught something, a seam in the wooden floor, almost invisible beneath the layers of grime and droppings. A trapdoor. Her hands shook as she knelt down, brushing away the debris. The trapdoor was small, maybe 2 feet square, with rope handles on either side. She pulled, and with a shower of dust, it lifted. Below was darkness. Sarah shone her light down and saw a ladder descending into a narrow shaft. The air that rose from below was cold and dry, carrying that same metallic scent she'd noticed on her first visit. Heart pounding, Sarah began to climb down. The shaft was tight, barely wide enough for her shoulders. It descended much farther than she expected, past the 3rd floor, past the 2nd, all the way down to what must have been below even the basement level. Finally, her feet touched solid ground. She was in a small chamber, maybe 10 feet square, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the fire station. The walls were brick, but older than the building above, the mortar black with age. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden cabinet, its surface covered in the same strange symbols she'd seen on the sealed door. Sarah approached slowly, hardly daring to breathe. The cabinet doors were locked, but when she tried the ornate brass key, the one that had opened the front door but hadn't worked on the sealed door upstairs, it slid into the lock with a soft click. The doors swung open. Inside were shelves, and on those shelves were bundles, dozens of them, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord that had gone brittle with age. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted the first bundle. The oilcloth fell away, revealing what lay inside. And in that moment, in a hidden chamber beneath a ruined fire station, Sarah Martinez's life changed forever. Sarah's hands shook as she unwrapped the first bundle. The oilcloth was heavy, stiff with age, and as it fell away, something inside caught the beam of her flashlight and blazed with reflected light. Gold. Not paint, not brass, but real gold. A rectangular bar, smaller than she expected, about the size of a deck of cards, but impossibly heavy in her palm. The surface bore markings, numbers stamped into the metal, and a symbol that looked like an eagle with spread wings. Sarah stared at it, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. She set the bar down carefully on the floor and reached for another bundle. This one held 2 more bars, identical to the first. The third bundle contained 3. She unwrapped them one by one, her breath coming in short gasps, her vision narrowing to the growing pile of gold at her feet. 4 bundles. 6. 10. When she finally stopped, 32 gold bars lay arranged on the stone floor of the hidden chamber, glowing in the beam of her flashlight like captured sunlight. But that wasn't all. Behind the gold, on a lower shelf of the cabinet, Sarah found a wooden box. She lifted it out carefully, the weight surprising her. Inside, wrapped in layers of yellowed tissue paper, were documents, thick sheets of paper covered in dense text and official seals. She unfolded the first one, squinting in the dim light. It was a bond. United States Liberty Bond, issued in 1918, denomination $50,000. Sarah's hands went numb. She lifted another sheet. Another bond, this one for $75,000. Another for $100,000. The dates were all the same, 1918, 1919, 1920. The signatures and seals looked genuine, though faded with age. She counted them twice, then a third time, her mind struggling to make sense of the numbers. 27 bonds, ranging from $50,000 to $200,000 each. If they were real, if they were still valid. Her legs gave out. Sarah sank to the floor, surrounded by gold and paper, and for a long moment, she couldn't breathe. The chamber was completely silent, except for the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness and the hammering of her own heart. How was this possible? Who had hidden this here? And why? She thought of her grandfather, of Harold Martinez, with his cold eyes, and his reputation for buying and selling other people's misfortunes. Had he known this was here? Is that why he'd bought the building for $1? But Marcus Webb had said Harold never searched the station, that he died before he could. So maybe Harold had suspected, had guessed, but never confirmed. And now it had fallen to Sarah, the granddaughter he'd never acknowledged, the one he'd left with nothing but a condemned building and impossible hope. She looked at the gold bars again, at the bonds, at the fortune that had been sealed away in darkness for God knew how long. The smart thing would be to call someone, the police maybe, or a lawyer, someone who knew what to do with something like this. But Sarah had learned long ago that calling for help usually just meant inviting more people to tell her what she couldn't have, what she didn't deserve, what wasn't really hers. The letter from Marcus Webb's card had said not to tell anyone, especially not the lawyer. She made a decision. Working quickly, Sarah rewrapped the gold bars in the oilcloth and carefully placed them in her backpack. The weight was enormous. She could only fit 8 bars, and even those made the pack so heavy she could barely lift it. The bonds went into a separate folder, which she tucked inside her jacket. She would have to make multiple trips. The chamber wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the rest of the gold. But she needed to get what she could out now, before anyone else discovered what was here. It took 3 hours to move everything. For 3 hours of climbing up and down that narrow shaft, her muscles screaming, her heart pounding every time she heard a sound from the building above. 3 hours of loading her car with bags and boxes, covering them with blankets, trying to look casual while transporting what might be millions of dollars in gold and bonds through the streets of Greenfield. By the time she finished, the sun was setting. Sarah drove home in a daze, checking her rearview mirror obsessively, certain that at any moment someone would pull her over, would somehow know what she was carrying. But no one stopped her. She parked in her building's garage, carried the bags upstairs in 2 trips, and locked the door behind her. Emma was still at the neighbor's. Sarah had time. She spread everything out on the living room floor. 32 gold bars, 27 bonds, a fortune so large her mind couldn't grasp the reality of it. The gold was first. She took photos of the markings on each bar, then searched online for similar images. It didn't take long to find matches. The eagle symbol belonged to the U.S. Mint. These were American gold bullion bars, likely dating to the early 1900s, based on the style of the stamps. Each bar weighed approximately 12.5 ounces, which meant Sarah's hands trembled as she checked the current price of gold, roughly $2,000 per ounce. Each bar was worth around $25,000. Times 32, $800,000. Just in the gold. She sat back, dizzy. $800,000. That was more money than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes. Maybe 20. That was house money, college money. We'll never worry about rent again and money. But the bonds were the real mystery. She photographed those too, then spent an hour researching Liberty bonds, trying to understand what she was looking at. The bonds had been issued by the U.S. government during and after World War I to finance the war effort. They were supposed to mature after a certain number of years, at which point the government would pay back the face value plus interest. But these bonds were over a century old. Were they still valid? Had they been redeemed already? Or were they worthless pieces of paper? Sarah found a number for the Treasury Department's Bureau of the Fiscal Service and made a note to call first thing Monday morning. Until then, she'd have to wait. But even if the bonds were worthless, the gold alone. Her phone rang, making her jump. It was her neighbor, letting her know Emma was getting tired and asking when Sarah would pick her up. 10 minutes, Sarah said, her voice shaking. I'll be right there. She gathered everything, the gold, the bonds, the photographs, and stuffed it all into the back of her bedroom closet, behind boxes of old clothes and Emma's outgrown toys. It wasn't a good hiding place, but it was the best she had. When she picked up Emma, her daughter was already half asleep. Sarah carried her upstairs, tucked her into bed, and then sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea she didn't drink, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened to her life. Monday morning, Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in 6 months. Her manager wasn't happy, but she didn't care. She waited until exactly 9 o'clock when the Treasury Department opened, and then called the number she'd found online. The woman who answered was polite, but clearly used to handling strange inquiries. Sarah explained as carefully as she could that she'd found some old Liberty bonds and wanted to know if they were still valid. "Do you have the certificate numbers?" the woman asked. Sarah read them off. There was a long pause. Then, "Can you hold, please?" 5 minutes passed. 10. Sarah's anxiety grew with each silent second. Finally, the woman came back on the line, and her voice had changed. It was sharper now, more focused. "Ma'am, where did you say you obtained these bonds?" "They were part of an inheritance," Sarah said carefully. "From my grandfather's estate." "Why?" "These particular certificates were reported lost in a fire in 1923, the woman said. They were never redeemed. And if they're authentic, and I want to emphasize that we'll need to verify that in person, they would have accrued interest for over a century. The Treasury Department has a program for replacing and redeeming lost securities, but there's a process." "How much would they be worth?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Another pause. "I can't give you an exact figure over the phone. But if these are genuine, and if they qualify for redemption, you're potentially looking at, well, a substantial sum, tens of millions of dollars, possibly more." The room tilted. Sarah gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Tens of millions? I need to transfer you to our securities division, the woman said. They'll want to schedule an appointment for authentication. Do not attempt to sell these bonds on the open market. And do not show them to anyone except official Treasury representatives. Do you understand? Yes, Sarah managed. Good. Hold, please. The rest of the call was a blur. Sarah answered questions, provided her contact information, and was told that a representative would call her back within 24 hours to schedule an in-person authentication. When she finally hung up, her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the phone. Tens of millions of dollars. The gold was a fortune. But the bonds were something else entirely. Life-changing didn't even begin to describe it. This was generational wealth. This was never work again, never worry again, buy anything you want kind of money. She should have felt elated, ecstatic. Instead, she felt terrified, because money like this didn't just appear. It didn't just fall into the hands of broke, single mothers living in run-down apartments. Money like this had a history, had a reason for being hidden away in the dark for 100 years. And now that she'd found it, now that she'd called the Treasury Department and started the process of claiming it, other people would know. Other people would come. She was right. That evening, as Sarah was making dinner, there was a knock at her door. Not the usual knock of a neighbor, but something harder, more insistent. She looked through the peephole and saw a man she'd never met before. Middle-aged, well-dressed, with the kind of confident posture that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. "Ms. Martinez?" he called through the door. "My name is Richard Ashford. I'm an attorney. I need to speak with you about your grandfather's estate." Sarah's blood ran cold. "I already handled the estate," she called back. "There's nothing more to discuss." "I'm afraid there is," Ashford said smoothly. "It's come to my attention that certain assets may have been improperly transferred. It'll only take a moment of your time." "I'm not interested," Sarah said. "Ms. Martinez, this is a legal matter. I strongly advise you to— Goodbye, Mr. Ashford." She turned away from the door and heard him knock again, harder this time. Then his voice, lower but still audible through the door. "You can't hide what you found. People already know. Be smart about this." Sarah stood frozen, listening as his footsteps retreated down the hallway. Her heart hammered in her chest. How did he know? She'd only made one phone call, and only talked to the Treasury Department. Unless someone had been watching her. Unless someone had seen her at the fire station, had followed her, had been waiting for this. She thought of Marcus Webb, her grandfather's accountant, the man who'd known about the station, who'd told her to check the tower, who'd warned her not to trust the lawyer. Which lawyer had he meant? The estate attorney, Mr. Whitmore? Or someone else? How many people had known or suspected what was hidden in that building? Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "That attorney at your door doesn't represent your interests. Neither do the people who will come tomorrow. You need protection. Call me." Below was a phone number. Sarah stared at the message, her mind racing. This was happening too fast. Everything was spinning out of control before she'd even had a chance to understand what she'd found. She didn't call the number. Instead, she went to her bedroom, pulled the gold and bonds from their hiding place, and stared at them. This fortune that had seemed like salvation just hours ago now felt like a curse. Every bar of gold, every yellowed bond certificate, represented something she didn't understand. A secret that had been buried for a reason. That night, Sarah barely slept. Every sound in the hallway made her jump. Every car that passed on the street below seemed to slow at her building. She lay in the dark, listening to Emma's soft breathing from the other bed, and wondered what she'd done. The next morning, there was an envelope under her door. No stamp, no return address, Just her name written in precise block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Your grandfather stole those bonds. They don't belong to you. Return them to their rightful owners, and no one gets hurt. You have 48 hours to decide. We're watching. Sarah's hands shook as she read the words again. Stole them? From who? And who was we? She thought of calling the police, but what would she say? That someone left a threatening note? That she'd found a fortune in gold and bonds hidden in a condemned building, and now people were coming after her? They'd probably just think she was crazy. Number. She needed to think this through. Needed to figure out what was really happening before she made another move. She called in sick to work again. Her manager was furious this time, threatening to cut her hours, but Sarah barely registered the words. She had bigger problems. She spent the morning researching, digging into the history of the fire station, trying to understand where the gold and bonds might have come from. The station had been built in 1889, had operated until 1963. That was 74 years. Decades of fires, of rescues, of firefighters coming and going. But the bonds were dated 1918 to 1920, the middle of World War I and just after. Had someone hidden them during the war? Why? And the gold, American bullion bars from the same era. Where would a firefighter get that kind of wealth? She found a digitized archive of old Greenfield newspapers and started searching. It took hours, but finally she found something that made her blood run cold. A small article from December 1920, buried on page 8 of the Greenfield Observer. Questions surround armory theft. Investigators continue to search for clues in the disappearance of war bonds and gold bullion from the Greenfield Army Reserve Armory last month. The theft, discovered during a routine audit, amounts to what officials estimate could be more than $2 million in government securities. Captain James Hendrick, the Armory's commanding officer, has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. No arrests have been made. Sarah read the article 3 times, her heart sinking further with each pass. $2 million in 1920. That would be worth, she couldn't even calculate it, tens of millions today, maybe more. And it had been stolen from a military armory, government property, which meant it belonged to the federal government, not to whoever had hidden it in the fire station. Not to her. She searched for follow-up articles but found only one more mention, from February 1921. Armory theft investigation closed. No charges filed. Captain Hendrick resigned his commission and left the area. The missing securities have not been recovered. That was it. The trail went cold. No more newspaper articles. No more mentions of Captain Hendrick or the theft. The story had simply disappeared, buried under decades of other news, other scandals, other crimes. But someone had remembered. Someone knew. And now that Sarah had found the bonds and called the Treasury Department, that someone was coming for them. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a government number, the Treasury Department calling back about authentication. Sarah let it go to voicemail. She couldn't deal with that now. Not until she understood what she was really holding. Another knock at the door. Sarah froze. This time, when she looked through the peephole, she saw a woman, young, maybe 30, with short dark hair and a professional appearance. Behind her stood a man in a dark suit, his hands clasped in front of him like a security guard. "Ms. Martinez," the woman called. "My name is Jennifer Moss. I'm with the Department of Justice. We need to speak with you about items in your possession that may be connected to a federal investigation." DOJ federal investigation. Sarah's stomach dropped. "I don't know what you're talking about," she called through the door, her voice shaking. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe you've contacted the Treasury Department about certain securities. Those securities are evidence in an ongoing investigation. No, we need to take them into protective custody for authentication and processing. If you refuse to cooperate, we can obtain a warrant." Sarah leaned against the wall, her mind racing. Was this real? Was this woman really from the DOJ? Or was this another attempt to take what she'd found? "I need to see credentials," she said. Through the peephole, she watched the woman hold up an official-looking badge. But Sarah had no idea if it was real or fake. She'd never seen a DOJ badge before. "I'll need to call and verify," Sarah said. "Come back in an hour." "Ms. Martinez." "1 hour," Sarah repeated firmly. Or, "Come back with a warrant." She waited until their footsteps retreated, then immediately grabbed her laptop. She searched for the DOJ's main number, called it, and asked to verify the identity of Jennifer Moss. The operator put her on hold for 10 minutes before coming back with, "I'm sorry, but we don't have anyone by that name in our system. Are you sure you have the correct department?" Sarah hung up, her hands trembling. Fake. The DOJ agent was fake, which meant people were willing to impersonate federal agents to get what she'd found, which meant this was bigger and more dangerous than she'd thought. She called Marcus Webb, the accountant who'd given her the card, who'd told her to check the tower. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Sarah left a message, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is Sarah Martinez. I need to speak with you immediately. People are coming. I don't know who to trust." While she waited for a callback, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't keep the gold and bonds in her apartment. Or it wasn't safe. She needed to move them somewhere secure until she could figure out what to do. She called a local bank, asked about safe deposit boxes. They had availability. She made an appointment for that afternoon. Moving the items was nerve-wracking. Sarah divided everything into several bags, trying to make them look casual, like groceries or laundry. She took a rideshare instead of driving, not trusting that her car wasn't being watched. Every person on the street seemed suspicious. Every car that slowed down made her pulse spike. But she made it to the bank without incident. The safe deposit box was large enough to hold all the gold bars and bond certificates. Sarah locked everything away, kept the key on a chain around her neck, and walked out feeling slightly less terrified. At least now it wasn't in her apartment. At least now if someone broke in, they wouldn't find what they were looking for. That evening, Marcus Webb finally called back. His voice was tense, urgent. "Ms. Martinez, I'm glad you called. We need to meet. But not at your apartment, and not anywhere public. Do you know the old Riverside Park on the north end?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Meet me there in 1 hour. Come alone. And Sarah, be careful. The people looking for what you found aren't the kind who take no for an answer." Sarah met him as the sun was setting, the park nearly empty in the cold December evening. Marcus was waiting on a bench near the river, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "You found it," he said as soon as she sat down. It wasn't a question. "The gold and the bonds," Sarah confirmed. "But I also found newspaper articles about a theft from a military armory in 1920. Marcus, that's stolen property. Federal property. I can't keep it." He shook his head. "It's more complicated than that. Your grandfather spent years researching this. The official story, the theft from the armory, was a cover. The real story is darker." "What do you mean?" Marcus looked out at the river, his expression grim. "Captain Hendrick, the man blamed for the theft, didn't steal anything. He discovered something. A conspiracy among his superior officers. They were skimming war bonds and gold from military shipments, hiding the evidence, planning to retrieve it after the war ended and attention had moved elsewhere. Hendrick found out, threatened to expose them. So they framed him for the theft, forced him to resign, made him disappear." "How do you know this?" Sarah asked. "Your grandfather found Hendrick's grandson 20 years ago. The man had documents, letters his grandfather had written before he died. Harold bought those letters, used them to piece together what really happened. The gold and bonds in that fire station were hidden by Hendrick himself. Insurance, he called it. Proof that the theft happened. Proof that he didn't take it. He hid it where his accusers would never think to look. Sarah's mind reeled. So if it wasn't Hendrick who stole them, then the real thieves were never caught, Marcus finished. And some of their descendants are still around, still wealthy, still powerful. They've been looking for that cash for 100 years. They know if it surfaces, if those bonds get traced back to their families, questions will be asked, investigations will be reopened, our reputations will be destroyed. That's why people are coming after me, Sarah whispered. Marcus nodded. They can't let you claim those bonds. They'll offer to buy you off first. If that doesn't work, they'll threaten you. And if that doesn't work... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Sarah felt cold despite her coat. What do I do? You fight, Marcus said simply. You go to the real Treasury Department, the real DOJ. You get authentication. You make this public before they can stop you. Once the story is out, once the evidence is verified, they can't touch you without admitting what their ancestors did. But you said those families are powerful. They are. But they're not above the law. Not if you're smart about this. Not if you move fast. Sarah sat in silence, watching the river flow past, dark and cold. Everything in her life had been a struggle. Every dollar, every meal, every moment of peace had been fought for and won with bleeding hands. She'd learned long ago that nothing was free, that luck was a myth, that the world gave nothing to people like her except more reasons to give up. But this was different. This was a fortune that came with a price, yes, but also with a chance to not just survive, but to expose a century-old wrong, to claim what had been hidden, what had been stolen from people who'd fought in a war and bought bonds to support their country, only to have those bonds taken by the very officers meant to protect them. I'll do it, Sarah said quietly. Tell me what I need to do. Marcus smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. First thing tomorrow, you call the Treasury Department back. You tell them you're ready for authentication. Then you call a real attorney, not Whitmore, not anyone connected to your grandfather's estate. Someone clean, someone who specializes in federal claims. I have a name. He handed her another card. This one read, Patricia Vance, J.D. Federal Claims Attorney. Patricia handled a case like this 5 years ago, Marcus said. Different circumstances, but similar stakes. She won't be intimidated. More importantly, she'll know how to navigate the bureaucracy without giving these people time to interfere. Sarah tucked the card in her pocket. Thank you, Marcus. Why are you helping me? His expression darkened. Because Harold was my friend, even if he was a hard man. And because I've spent 30 years watching wealthy people get away with things that would put normal people in prison for life. If those bonds can help you while exposing what their families did, then that's justice. Real justice. They parted ways as full darkness fell. Sarah walked back to where she'd left her car, constantly checking over her shoulder. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every distant figure might be watching. When she got home, Emma was already asleep. The neighbor who'd been watching her asked no questions, just handed her the sleeping child and wished her good night. Sarah carried Emma to bed, tucked her in, and then sat in the kitchen with all the lights off, staring at nothing. Tomorrow she would call the Treasury Department. Tomorrow she would hire Patricia Vance. Tomorrow she would start the process of claiming what she'd found, of exposing what had been hidden. But tonight, she allowed herself to imagine what might come after. A real house with a yard where Emma could play. College paid for. fully, without loans or debt. Never working 3 jobs again. Never choosing between food and medicine. Never again lying awake, terrified of eviction. The gold was worth $800,000. The bonds, if they were authentic, if they accrued interest, if everything Marcus said was true, could be worth $30 million or more. 30 million. It was an impossible number. A dream number. But for the first time in her life, Sarah let herself believe it might be real. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Patricia Vance's office, requesting an emergency consultation. Then, she set 3 alarms for 6 a.m., each one louder than the last. Tomorrow, she would start fighting, and she would not stop until she won. Patricia Vance's office was nothing like Sarah had expected. Instead of the gleaming high-rise she'd imagined, she found herself in a modest suite on the 3rd floor of an older building downtown, the kind with creaky elevators and frosted glass doors that bore hand-painted names. But the moment Patricia stood to shake her hand, Sarah knew Marcus had sent her to the right person. Patricia was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to see through pretense like glass. She listened to Sarah's story without interrupting, taking notes in precise handwriting, nodding occasionally, but revealing nothing of what she thought until Sarah had finished. "You're in danger," Patricia said finally, setting down her pen. "Not immediate physical danger. These people are too smart for that. But legal danger. They'll try to tie you up in lawsuits, claim the property transfer was fraudulent, argue that you had no legal right to search the building. They'll throw everything at you to delay authentication long enough to make you give up." "I won't give up," Sarah said quietly. Patricia smiled. "Good. Because we're going to move fast, faster than they expect. I'm calling the Treasury Department today, arranging emergency authentication. We'll also contact the National Archives, the Department of Justice, the real one. And we're going to make this very public, very quickly." "Public?" Sarah's stomach tightened. "Won't that make things worse?" "It'll make things safer," Patricia corrected. "Right now, you're vulnerable because you're alone and quiet. But once this story breaks, once the media knows about a century-old theft and a wrongly accused officer and a single mother who found the evidence, you become untouchable. They can't make you disappear without the whole world watching." Sarah thought of Emma, of the threats, of the fake agents at her door. How long will this take? If we're lucky, 2 weeks. If we're not, Patricia's expression hardened. However long it takes. But Sarah, you need to understand something. When this gets out, your life changes forever. Not just the money. The attention, the pressure, the people who will want pieces of you. Are you ready for that? Sarah thought of the eviction notice, of choosing between heating and food, of Emma's teacher's pitying looks. I've been ready my whole life. The next morning, Patricia filed paperwork with 3 different federal agencies simultaneously. By afternoon, Sarah had an appointment at the Treasury Department's regional office for the following Monday. By evening, Patricia had contacted a journalist she knew at the Washington Post, someone who specialized in historical investigations and government accountability. The journalist's name was Daniel Reeves, and he arrived at Patricia's office the next day with a recorder and a skeptical expression that melted away as Sarah told her story, and showed him photographs of the bonds and gold bars. "This is incredible," he murmured, studying the images. "Do you know what this means? Not just for you, but for the historical record? If Captain Hendrick really was framed, or if those bonds can be traced back to the actual thieves." "Will you write it?" Patricia interrupted. "Before authentication. We need the story out there now, while it's still developing." Daniel looked at her sharply. "You want to force their hand, make it impossible for anyone to suppress the investigation." "Exactly." He thought for a moment, then nodded. I'll need to verify everything independently. Talk to experts, check the historical records. But if this checks out, and I think it will, I can have a story ready by Friday. Friday. That was 4 days away. 4 days until the whole world would know what Sarah had found. 4 days for everything to change. Those 4 days felt like the longest of Sarah's life. She went to work, came home, took care of Emma, and tried to act normal while her phone buzzed constantly with updates from Patricia and increasingly threatening messages from unknown numbers. "You're making a mistake," one text read. "Take the settlement offer. $2 million, cash, no questions, final offer." Another. "Think about your daughter. Think about what you're risking." And another. "The Hendricks were criminals. The bonds are stolen property. You have no legal claim." Sarah blocked each number as they came, but new ones always appeared. Patricia advised her to save every message as evidence. On Wednesday, 2 days before Daniel's article was set to run, Sarah's sister Laura called. They hadn't spoken since the initial conversation about the inheritance. "What the hell are you doing?" Laura demanded. "I just got a call from some lawyer asking questions about you and grandfather." "Sarah, what have you gotten into?" "I found something," Sarah said carefully. "Something important. Something valuable. I heard. Mom heard too. Everyone's heard. There are people calling the family, asking questions, offering money for information." Laura's voice rose. "Do you have any idea what kind of attention you're bringing on us?" "I didn't ask for this," Sarah said, her own anger rising. "I didn't ask for grandfather to leave me that building. I didn't ask to find what was hidden there. But I did find it, and I'm not going to just hand it over to people who want to keep a century-old crime buried." "A crime?" "Sarah, you're talking about something that happened before we were born. Before our parents were born. Why does it matter?" "Because it matters to me," Sarah said quietly. "Because for once in my life, I'm not going to let powerful people tell me what I'm worth. And because that money, if I can claim it, means Emma gets a future. A real future. Not the one I've been scrambling to give her while working 3 jobs and still falling behind." There was a long silence. Then Laura said more softly, "Is it really that much? The rumors." "It's enough," Sarah said. "More than enough." Another pause. "Be careful," Laura said finally. "These people, if they're as powerful as you say, they won't just give up." "I know," Sarah said, "but neither will I." The article ran online Friday at 6 a.m., timed to catch the morning news cycle. Sarah's phone started ringing before she was fully awake. The headline read, "Single mother discovers $30 million in war bonds hidden in condemned fire station and uncovers a century-old military scandal." Daniel Reeves had done his homework. The article laid out everything. The theft from the Greenfield Armory in 1920, Captain Hendrick's forced resignation and disappearance, the decades of silence, Harold Martinez's research, and finally Sarah's discovery. He'd found military historians who confirmed that bond theft from armories had been a problem during the war. He'd located descendants of Captain Hendrick who provided family letters supporting the frame job theory. He'd even found records showing that 3 of Hendrick's superior officers had all become suspiciously wealthy in the years following the war. And he'd named their families, though not directly. The Post's lawyers had been careful, but clearly enough that anyone paying attention would know who stood to lose the most if Sarah's claim was authenticated. By noon, the story had been picked up by every major news network. By evening, camera crews were camped outside Sarah's apartment building. Patricia had to issue a statement on Sarah's behalf, asking for privacy, while the authentication process moved forward. The pressure was immense. Sarah stopped going to work. Her manager had fired her anyway after seeing her face on TV. She kept Emma home from school, afraid of reporters approaching her daughter. They stayed inside, curtains drawn, living on delivered groceries, while the world outside went crazy with speculation. But Patricia had been right about one thing. The attention made Sarah untouchable. The threats stopped. The mysterious phone calls ceased. The people who'd been circling her, trying to intimidate her into silence, had retreated into their own silence, because now the whole world was watching. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. Sarah dressed in the only professional clothes she owned, a thrift store blazer and pants that didn't quite match, and took a taxi to the Treasury Department's regional office. Patricia met her there, along with Daniel Reeves, who'd been granted permission to observe the authentication process. The office was sterile and bureaucratic, all fluorescent lights and government-issue furniture. But the people who greeted them were different from what Sarah expected. Not cold or dismissive, but genuinely excited. "Ms. Martinez," said the lead authenticator, a woman named Dr. Ellen Zhao. "Now what you've brought us is extraordinary. I've been with the Treasury for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like this." They spent 6 hours in a secure room while Dr. Zhao and her team examined the bonds. They checked the paper, the ink, the seals, the signatures. They compared the certificate numbers against historical records. They used equipment Sarah didn't understand, spectrographs and UV lights and chemical tests, to verify every detail. Finally, as the afternoon light was fading outside the windows, Dr. Zhao looked up with a smile. "They're authentic," she said. "All 27 certificates. Original Liberty bonds, issued between 1918 and 1920. Never redeemed, legally valid under the Lost Securities Program." Sarah's legs went weak. Patricia gripped her arm, steadying her. "What's the total value?" Patricia asked. For Dr. Zhao pulled out a calculator and a thick binder of interest tables. "The face value of the bonds totals approximately $2.3 million. However, under the terms of the original securities, they accrue interest at rates between 3.5 and 4.5%, compounded annually. Over 103 years, with that compounding." She tapped numbers into the calculator. "The total redemption value comes to approximately $287 million. The room went completely silent. Sarah heard the number but couldn't process it. $287 million. Not $30 million as the article had estimated. Nearly $300 million. Plus, Dr. Zhao continued, there's the gold. The bullion bars have been verified as authentic U.S. Treasury gold from the same era. Current market value approximately $850,000. Combined, so you're looking at a total claim of just over $287.8 million. Patricia was the first to recover. What's the timeline for redemption? There are procedures, Dr. Zhao said. Normally this would take months, possibly years. But given the circumstances, the media attention, the historical significance, the potential criminal investigation into the original theft, my superiors have authorized an expedited process. We can have initial payment processed within 30 days, with the full amount following within 60 days, pending final verification. Initial payment? Sarah managed to ask, her voice barely working. We typically release 10% immediately in cases like this, as a good faith gesture while the paperwork is completed. In your case, that would be approximately $28.8 million. $28.8 million in 30 days. And that was just the beginning. Sarah sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Patricia's hand was still on her arm, anchoring her to reality. Daniel Reeves was writing furiously in his notebook, his face lit with the expression of someone who knows they're witnessing history. There's one more thing, Dr. Zhao said, her voice gentler now. The Treasury Department is also reopening the investigation into the 1920 theft. Based on the documentation you've provided and the historical records we've accessed, It's clear that Captain Hendrick was telling the truth. The real perpetrators were never caught. While we can't prosecute crimes this old, we can set the record straight. Captain Hendrick's name will be cleared. His descendants will receive an official apology from the Department of Defense. Sarah thought of Marcus Webb, and of his words about justice. Real justice. "When will that happen?" she asked. "We're holding a press conference next Friday," Dr. Zhao said. "We'd like you to be there. You and Captain Hendrick's family. The story deserves to be told properly." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The news broke that evening. The authentication was official. The bonds were real. Sarah Martinez, single mother and former diner waitress, was about to become one of the wealthiest women in the state. The media frenzy intensified. Sarah's apartment building was surrounded by reporters. Her phone rang constantly. People she hadn't spoken to in years, high school acquaintances, distant relatives, her ex-husband's family, suddenly wanted to reconnect. Patricia advised her to say nothing, to let the legal process play out quietly. But she also suggested Sarah might want to move, at least temporarily. The attention wasn't going to die down anytime soon. Sarah took her advice. Using a small advance from Patricia's firm, she rented a house in a quiet suburb under Patricia's name. Nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom ranch with a yard where Emma could play safely, away from cameras and questions. The first night in the new house, Sarah stood in Emma's bedroom doorway and watched her daughter sleep in a real bed, in a real room, with walls that weren't shared with neighbors who fought at 2 a.m. Emma didn't know yet. Didn't know that everything was about to change. Sarah had told her only that they were staying somewhere safe for a little while. She would tell her the truth soon. But for now, she let her daughter sleep in peace. So the 30 days passed in a blur of paperwork and interviews and legal proceedings. The families of the officers who'd stolen the bonds tried to file an injunction, arguing that the bonds should be returned to the armory as military property. But the injunction was quickly dismissed. The bonds had been purchased by citizens with real money. The armory had no claim to them beyond what it owed to those original purchasers, and that debt now belonged to Sarah. Other people came forward with other claims, distant relatives of Harold Martinez arguing they deserved a share of the inheritance. Lawyers representing historical research organizations who wanted to study the bonds. Even a group claiming to represent Captain Hendrick's estate, arguing that if he'd hidden the bonds, they belonged to his heirs. Patricia shut down each claim methodically. The property had been legally transferred to Sarah. The discovery had been made on her property. The bonds had been abandoned for over a century. Under every applicable law, they were hers. On day 28, Sarah received a call from the Treasury Department. The initial payment had been processed. $28.8 million had been transferred to an escrow account in her name. Sarah stared at her computer screen, at the bank balance that showed more zeros than she'd ever imagined seeing. It didn't feel real. It felt like a number, abstract and meaningless, until Patricia called with a list of things that needed to be done immediately. "First, we set up trusts," Patricia said, "for Emma's education, for your long-term security. Then we pay off your debts, every single one. Then we establish a charitable foundation. It'll help with taxes and give you a way to control the narrative about what you're doing with the money." Sarah barely heard the details. She was thinking about the eviction notice that had been taped to her old apartment door. The $2,400 she couldn't pay. The amount that had felt impossible just 2 months ago. She'd paid it off that morning, wrote a check for the full amount plus penalties, plus enough to cover 6 months of rent for the family that had moved into her old apartment. The landlord had stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "Pay the debts," Sarah said finally. "All of them. Medical bills, credit cards, everything. I want to start clean." "Good," Patricia said. "Now, There's something else. The press conference is this Friday. Captain Hendrick's grandson will be there. His name is James Hendrick. He's 72 now. The Defense Department is issuing a formal apology and clearing his grandfather's name. They want you to speak. Just a few words about the discovery and what it means to you. Sarah's throat tightened. I don't know if I can. You can, Patricia said firmly. You've done the hard part. Everything else is just telling the truth. Friday arrived. Sarah wore a new suit, still modest, still simple, but one that actually fit. Patricia and Daniel Reeves accompanied her to the Defense Department's Media Center in Washington, where a small stage had been set up with the American flag as backdrop. James Hendrick was waiting in the green room. He was a tall man with white hair and his grandfather's sharp blue eyes. When he saw Sarah, he stood and extended his hand. Ms. Martinez, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. You've given my family something we never thought we'd have. The truth. Sarah shook his hand, feeling the tremor in his grip. Your grandfather hid those bonds to prove his innocence. He deserved better than what happened to him. He did, James agreed. But because of you, at least his name will be cleared. His great-grandchildren will know he wasn't a thief. That's worth more than money. The press conference was packed with reporters and cameras. A Department of Defense spokesperson read a prepared statement acknowledging that Captain James Hendrick had been wrongly accused, that new evidence had come to light proving his innocence, and that the department deeply regretted the injustice done to him and his family. Then they invited James Hendrick to speak. He talked about his grandfather, about growing up with the shadow of accusation hanging over his family, about what it meant to finally have the truth acknowledged. Finally, they called Sarah to the microphone. She stood there, blinded by camera flashes, and for a moment couldn't remember a single word she'd planned to say. Then she thought of Emma, of the apartment with the broken heater, of every night she'd gone to bed, wondering how she'd make it through another day. 2 months ago, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I was about to be evicted. I was working 3 jobs and still couldn't feed my daughter properly. When my grandfather left me a condemned fire station, people laughed. They told me I was foolish for accepting it. They said it was worthless. She paused, and looking out at the sea of faces. They were wrong, but this isn't just about money. It's about what happens when you refuse to give up, even when everything seems hopeless. It's about listening to the quiet voice that says, maybe, just maybe, there's something worth fighting for. Captain Hendrick fought for the truth, and that truth stayed hidden for 100 years. But it didn't disappear. It couldn't disappear. And now, it's been found. She looked at James Hendrick. Your grandfather wasn't a thief. He was a man of honor who refused to be part of a crime, and who paid for that honor with his reputation and his future. I'm grateful I could help set the record straight. And I'm grateful that out of darkness and injustice, something good could finally come. The room erupted in applause. Sarah stepped back from the microphone, on her hands shaking. Patricia was there immediately, guiding her off stage, whispering that she'd done perfectly. In the green room afterward, James Hendrick embraced her, tears running down his weathered cheeks. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for giving us our grandfather back. The story dominated the news cycle for days. Single mother's discovery, clears war, hero's name after century of false accusations. Liberty bonds hidden for 100 years, now worth $288 million. From eviction to fortune, the incredible story of Sarah Martinez. The attention was overwhelming. Sarah had to hire security to keep reporters away from the house. She had to get a new phone number after the old one was leaked and flooded with calls. She couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. But slowly, carefully, with Patricia's guidance, and she began to build a new life. The full payment came through 60 days after authentication. $287.8 million, transferred in stages to various accounts and trusts. Sarah would never have to worry about money again. Neither would Emma, or Emma's children, or their children after that. But the money wasn't what changed Sarah the most. It was what she did with it. She paid off medical debts for 100 families in her old neighborhood, set up a scholarship fund for single parents trying to finish their education, bought and renovated the apartment building where she'd almost been evicted, then offered affordable rent to working families who needed a chance. She bought Station Number 9, which was technically still hers anyway, and turned it into a community center. The building was restored carefully, preserving its history while making it safe and functional. The bell tower, where Sarah had found the hidden chamber, became a small museum dedicated to Captain Hendrick and to the firefighters who'd served there for 74 years. At the grand opening, 6 months after the discovery, Sarah stood in the apparatus bay, now clean and bright and full of people, and looked around at what had become of that ruined shell. Her sister Laura was there, apologetic and awkward, but trying. Her mother came too, crying as she told Sarah how proud she was. Emma ran through the crowd, delighted by all the space and attention, too young still to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to know their lives had changed. Marcus Webb stood near the back, watching with a satisfied smile. Patricia Vance was there with her family, still Sarah's attorney, but also, somehow, her friend. James Hendrick and his children and grandchildren had come, the family finally free of a burden they'd carried for generations. And Daniel Reeves was there, of course, taking notes for the follow-up story he was writing about what happens after the discovery, after the authentication, after the money. Sarah gave a brief speech, thanking everyone who'd helped, talking about the importance of community and second chances and fighting for truth even when it seems impossible. But the words that stuck with her, the words she thought about later that night as she tucked Emma into bed in their new house. Not the rental, but the real house she'd bought with a yard and a swing set and enough bedrooms for Emma to have friends stay over, were the ones Marcus had said to her as he was leaving. Your grandfather would be proud, he'd told her, not because of the money, but because you didn't let them bury the truth. You didn't let power win. Sarah thought about that, about Harold Martinez, the grandfather she'd barely known, the hard man who'd somehow known to leave her the fire station. Had he known what was inside? Or had he just hoped, the way Sarah had hoped against, hope that maybe, just maybe, something good would come? She'd never know, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd fought. She'd refused to accept that a condemned building was all she deserved. She'd climbed down into the darkness and found light. And she'd taken that light and used it to illuminate not just her own life, but the truth of what had happened a century ago and the lives of everyone she could reach. A year after the discovery, Sarah sat in the study of her house, a real study, with built-in bookshelves and a desk that faced a window overlooking the garden where Emma played, and thought about the journey she'd been on. The money was there, would always be there. She'd set up trusts and foundations and investments that would generate more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. Emma would go to any college she wanted, would never know what it felt like to choose between heating and eating, would never understand the particular desperation of being one missed paycheck away from homelessness. But Sarah didn't want her to forget where they'd come from. So she kept photographs of the old apartment, kept the eviction notice framed in her office, kept the first key ring that had held the brass keys to Station Number 9. And she told Emma the story, again and again. The story of how hope sometimes hides in the most unlikely places, how perseverance matters more than luck, how truth, once buried, fights to surface again. We could have given up so many times, Sarah told her daughter one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and amber. When the lawyer told me the building was worthless, when people threatened us, when it would have been easier to just walk away and accept that life was never going to get better. But you didn't give up, Emma said. She was 8 now, old enough to understand the story, young enough to still think her mother hung the moon. No, Sarah agreed. I didn't. And that made all the difference. She thought about the families she'd helped, the scholarships she'd funded, the community center that bore Captain Hendrick's name. She thought about James Hendrick's tears of gratitude, about the wrong that had been made right after 100 years of injustice. The money had changed everything, but the fight, the refusal to be silent, to be intimidated, to accept that powerful people could bury the truth forever, that had changed her. She was no longer the frightened woman who couldn't afford her daughter's field trip. She was someone who'd faced down threats and pressure and fear, who'd stood in front of cameras and told the world what she'd found, who'd fought for justice, not just for herself, but for a man she'd never met, and a family that had suffered in silence for generations. And she'd won. The sun dipped below the horizon. Sarah squeezed Emma's hand and felt her daughter squeeze back. Inside the house, a dinner was waiting. Tomorrow, she had a meeting with the Foundation's board to discuss new scholarship recipients. Next week, Emma started piano lessons. The week after that, Sarah was speaking at a conference about women's financial empowerment. Life moved forward, rich and full and certain in a way it had never been before. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would dream of station number 9, of climbing down that narrow shaft into darkness, of opening the cabinet and seeing the gold gleam in the flashlight's beam, of the moment when everything changed, and she would wake with her heart full, grateful for the grandfather she'd never known, grateful for the condemned building everyone said was worthless, grateful for the courage it took to climb down into darkness, not knowing what waited below. Because sometimes, the things we're told are worthless turn out to hold everything we need. Sometimes, the buildings everyone else has forgotten contain the secrets that change everything. And sometimes, a single mother with nothing left to lose finds not just a fortune, but proof that hope, however deeply buried, never really dies. It only waits for someone brave enough to dig it free. 3 days after the Washington Post article broke, Sarah's ex-husband showed up at the rental house. She saw him through the window, that familiar swagger in his walk, and her stomach knotted with old, familiar dread. She hadn't spoken to David in almost 2 years, not since the divorce was finalized, and he'd moved to Arizona with his new girlfriend, washing his hands of both Sarah and Emma with the efficiency that still stung. She opened the door before he could knock, not wanting Emma to hear. "David," she said flatly, "what do you want?" He'd aged since she'd last seen him. His hairline had receded further, and there were new lines around his eyes. But the smile was the same, that calculated charm that had once made her feel special and later made her feel like a fool for believing it. "Sarah," he said warmly, as if they were old friends meeting for coffee, "you look great. This place is nice, real nice upgrade from that dump apartment." I asked what you want. His smile flickered. "Can't a father want to see his daughter? I heard about your windfall. Pretty incredible story. I always knew you were resourceful." Sarah's jaw tightened. "You haven't called Emma in 8 months. You missed her birthday. You stopped sending child support 6 months before that. So I'll ask one more time. What do you want?" David's expression hardened, the mask slipping. "Look, I know things got difficult. The job in Arizona didn't work out like I hoped. And Melissa and I don't care about you and Melissa," Sarah interrupted. "You abandoned your daughter. You don't get to show up now because you read about money." "Emma's my daughter too," David said, his voice taking on an edge. "I have rights, and I've been thinking, now that you're, set financially, maybe it's time Emma came to live with me. Give her some stability, a proper family environment." The audacity of it stole Sarah's breath. For a moment, she could only stare at him. Then, slowly, she felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. It wasn't the old fear, the old desperate need to keep the peace. It was something new, something forged in the weeks of threats and pressure and fighting for what was hers. "Get off my property," she said quietly. "Sarah, now, before I call the police and tell them that a man who owes $12,000 in back child support is harassing me at my home." David's face flushed. "You can't keep me from my daughter. I'll file for custody. I'll tell the court about what?" Sarah stepped forward, and David actually took a step back. "About how I found a legal inheritance and claimed it through proper channels. About how I've provided Emma with a safe home, good food, stability, everything you couldn't be bothered to help with. Go ahead. File. My attorney would love to explain to a judge exactly what kind of father you've been." She watched the fight drain from him. He'd expected the old Sarah, and the one who could be pushed around, who was too tired and too scared to fight back. He hadn't expected this. "I'm her father," he said, but the words came out weak now, almost pleading. Doesn't that count for something? Being a father is more than biology, David. It's showing up. It's caring. It's being there when things are hard, not just when there's money on the table. Sarah's voice softened slightly. "If you want a relationship with Emma, a real one, then you start by being consistent, by calling when you say you will, by visiting on a schedule and keeping your promises. You do that for 6 months, a year, and we'll talk. But you don't get to waltz in here demanding custody because you think there's money to be gained." David opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely ashamed. "I messed up," he said finally. "I know I did. Yes, you did. And Emma deserved better. Still deserves better." He nodded slowly, then turned to leave. At the edge of the driveway, he stopped and looked back. "For what it's worth, Sarah, I'm glad things worked out for you. I really am." Sarah said nothing. She watched him get in his car and drive away, and only when he was out of sight did she allow herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From relief. From the realization that she'd stood her ground and won. Patricia called an hour later. "I heard about David's visit. The security cameras caught it." "You have cameras on the house?" "After the threats? Of course I do. He won't be back, will he?" Sarah thought about the look on David's face when she'd mentioned the back child support. "No, I don't think he will." "Good. Sarah, I need to tell you something. There's a hearing next week about the custody of Emma. David filed emergency paperwork yesterday." Sarah's blood ran cold. "He said he'd file, but I didn't think he did. But don't panic. I've already submitted your counterfiling. We have 12 months of documented neglect, missed child support payments, and witness testimony about his absence. The judge will see through this. I promise you." The hearing was 5 days later. Sarah sat in the courtroom, dressed in her new suit, with Patricia beside her, and a folder full of documentation that painted a clear picture. David Martinez had abandoned his daughter for nearly 2 years, and was only interested now because of money. David's attorney, court-appointed, Sarah noted, tried to argue that David had been struggling financially, that he'd always intended to be part of Emma's life, that Sarah's sudden wealth created an unstable environment, full of media attention and security concerns. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened patiently. Then she asked David directly, "Mr. Martinez, When was the last time you spoke to your daughter? David shifted in his seat. It's been several months. I lost my phone and… You lost your phone 8 months ago and didn't acquire a new one? Or couldn't find another way to contact an 8-year-old child? I was planning to reach out. You stopped paying child support last March. That's 11 months ago. Why? I lost my job, Your Honor. Things were tight. Ms. Martinez also lost her job during this period, the judge said, though consulting her notes. She was working 3 jobs to support herself and your daughter, while you sent nothing. Is that correct? David said nothing. The judge looked at Sarah. Ms. Martinez, do you believe Mr. Martinez is genuinely interested in his daughter's well-being? Sarah thought about lying, about being diplomatic. Then she remembered Emma asking why Daddy never called, the hurt in her daughter's eyes that no amount of explanation could ease. No, Your Honor. I think he's interested in the money I've recently come into. I think if Emma and I were still living in that 1-bedroom apartment, struggling to eat, we wouldn't be in this courtroom today. The judge nodded slowly. Mr. Martinez, I'm denying your petition for custody. However, I'm ordering you to begin supervised visitation, 2 hours every other weekend, if you wish to rebuild a relationship with your daughter. You'll also begin paying child support again, the full amount you owe in arrears plus current payments. If you miss a single payment or a single visitation, this order becomes void, and you'll need to petition again. And I assure you, I'll remember this hearing. She looked at Sarah. Ms. Martinez, I'm granting you sole legal and physical custody. The visitation is voluntary on your part. If Emma expresses that she doesn't want to see her father, you're under no obligation to force it. Outside the courthouse, Patricia squeezed Sarah's arm. You did it. I told the truth, Sarah said. That's all. David didn't show up for the first scheduled visitation. Or the second. Sarah wasn't surprised, but she kept the documentation just in case. Some fights, she'd learned, when you won by simply being ready to keep fighting. Scene. Telling Emma the truth. Sarah waited until Emma's 9th birthday to tell her the full truth. They were in the backyard of their new house, just the 2 of them, sitting on a blanket under the oak tree. The party had ended hours ago. 15 of Emma's classmates, a bounce house, a magician, more cake than any group of children should reasonably consume. It had been perfect, the kind of birthday Sarah had always wanted to give her daughter, but never could. Emma, I need to talk to you about something important, Sarah began. Emma looked up from the new art set she'd been organizing. About why we moved, and why there are cameras, and why Jacob's mom asked if we were famous. Sort of, yeah. Sarah took a breath. Remember the old fire station Grandpa Harold left me? The one we visited that seemed scary? Emma nodded. The one with all the broken windows. Right. Well, after we looked around, I went back by myself, and I found something hidden there, something that had been there for a very long time. She told the story simply, leaving out the threats and the fear, focusing instead on the mystery of it. The hidden chamber. The gold bars. The bonds that Captain Hendrick had hidden to prove he wasn't a thief. The way the Treasury Department had confirmed everything was real. Emma listened with wide eyes. When Sarah finished, her daughter was quiet for a long moment. Then, so we're rich now? Yes, honey. Very rich. Like, buy a pony rich? Sarah laughed despite the seriousness of the moment. Yes, like buy a pony rich, though we're not buying a pony. Okay. Emma thought some more. Is that why Dad came to visit? Sarah's heart squeezed. She'd thought Emma had been in her room during that confrontation, but clearly she'd heard or seen something. Yes, sweetheart. That's why. He never cared before, Emma said matter-of-factly. When you were crying because we couldn't pay rent, he didn't care then. No, Sarah agreed softly. He didn't. So the money? It doesn't make people love you. It just makes them pretend. The wisdom in her 9-year-old daughter's words made Sarah's throat tight. Some people, yes, but not everyone. The people who loved us before still love us. And we're going to use this money to help other people. People who are struggling the way we used to struggle. Would you like to help me do that? Emma's face brightened. Really? How? Well, I'm starting a foundation. That's like a special organization that helps people. We could help families pay for things they need. We could help kids go to college. We could fix up buildings in our old neighborhood so they're safer. What do you think? Can we help kids whose parents can't afford field trips, like Mrs. Chen's class trips? Sarah pulled her daughter close. Absolutely. That's exactly the kind of thing we can help with. Then I think it's good, Emma said. I think Grandpa Harold, even though I didn't know him, I think he'd be glad we found it. Because now we can help people. I think so too, baby. I think so too. Scene for us, the first family. Sarah helped. The letter came through the Foundation's brand new website, one of hundreds Sarah received in the first months. But something about this one caught her attention. Dear Ms. Martinez, my name is Jennifer Ochoa. I'm a single mother with 2 children, ages 6 and 4. 3 months ago, my son Miguel was diagnosed with leukemia. The treatments are covered by insurance, but the travel costs, the time off work, the special foods he needs. I can't keep up. We're about to lose our apartment. I don't know where else to turn. I saw your story and thought maybe, if you're really helping people like us, maybe you could help Miguel. I don't need much, just enough to keep the lights on while we fight this cancer. Thank you for reading this. I know you get a lot of requests. Jennifer. Sarah read the letter 3 times, then called Patricia. I want to help this family. How do I do it? We have processes, Patricia said. Application review, financial verification, committee approval. How long does that take? 4 to 6 weeks, typically. This kid has cancer, Patricia. He doesn't have 6 weeks to wait while we process paperwork. Can't we just help? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Sarah, if you bypass the process for one person, word will get out. You'll be overwhelmed with requests to do the same for everyone. Then we figure out a faster process. But right now, today, I want to help Jennifer Ochoa and her son Miguel. Can we do that? Yes, Patricia said finally. Yes, we can do that. 2 days later, Sarah drove to Jennifer's apartment, a 3rd-floor walk-up in a building that reminded her painfully of her old place. The door was answered by a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, with dark circles under her eyes and the kind of exhaustion that went bone deep. Ms. Ochoa? I'm Sarah Martinez. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth. You came. I didn't think. I sent dozens of letters to different charities and foundations. I never thought. Can I come in? The apartment was tiny but spotlessly clean, decorated with children's drawings taped to the walls. A small boy sat on the couch, bald from chemotherapy, watching cartoons. He looked up when they entered, his eyes huge in his thin face. Miguel, Jennifer said softly. This is Ms. Martinez. She came to visit. Hi, Miguel said shyly. Sarah sat down next to him. Hi, Miguel. Your mom tells me you're fighting a dragon right now. Miguel's face brightened slightly. Leukemia isn't a dragon. I don't know, Sarah said seriously. Sounds pretty dragon-like to me. Big and scary, but you're brave enough to fight it anyway. I'm not that brave, Miguel admitted. Neither treatments hurt. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared, Sarah told him. It means being scared but fighting anyway, which is exactly what you're doing. She turned to Jennifer. I've talked to my foundation. We're going to cover 6 months of your rent, Miguel's specialized food costs, and transportation to all his treatments. We're also setting up a fund to cover any gaps in medical expenses that insurance doesn't handle. And, she pulled out a folder. Here's information about our emergency housing program. If anything happens, and you need to move quickly, We'll help with that, too." Jennifer was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand. Why would you do this? You don't know us." "I know what it's like to be drowning," Sarah said simply. "I know what it's like to choose between rent and medicine, and to lie awake, terrified of what tomorrow brings. I can't fix everything, but I can fix this. Let me fix this. How do I pay you back? You don't. But maybe someday, when Miguel is healthy and grown and you're stable again, you help someone else. That's the payment." 3 months later, Sarah received another letter from Jennifer. Miguel's cancer was in remission. They'd been able to move to a better apartment near the hospital. Jennifer had taken a better job with flexible hours, and she'd started volunteering at a cancer support group, helping other families navigate the system. "You gave us more than money," Jennifer wrote. "You gave us hope when we had none left. You showed us that the world still has good people in it. Thank you doesn't seem like enough, but it's all I have. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for seeing us." Sarah kept that letter in her desk drawer. On hard days, when the pressure of managing the foundation felt overwhelming, when people accused her of only helping for publicity, when critics claimed she was wasting the money, she'd read Jennifer's words and remember why she'd started this. Scene: visiting Captain Hendrick's grave. 4 months after the press conference, Sarah drove to the cemetery where Captain James Hendrick was buried. She'd gotten the location from his grandson, who'd mentioned that the family hadn't been able to afford a proper headstone until recently. The cemetery was old, on the outskirts of Greenfield, with weathered monuments and ancient oak trees. She found the grave easily. The new headstone was bright white granite against the faded gray of the surrounding markers. So a Captain James Albert Hendrick, 1892 to 1967, honorable man, vindicated in truth. Sarah knelt by the grave, feeling slightly foolish, but needing to do this anyway. "Captain Hendrick," she said quietly, "I'm Sarah Martinez. I'm the one who found what you hid." A breeze stirred through the oak leaves, but otherwise the cemetery was silent. "I wanted to tell you that your name is cleared. Your family knows the truth now. Your grandson cried when the Defense Department apologized. He said it was the first time he'd felt proud of his name without shame attached to it." She placed a small American flag by the headstone, the kind they gave out on Memorial Day. "I also wanted to say thank you. You hid those bonds to prove your innocence, but by doing that, you saved my life 100 years later. I was drowning, Captain. I had nothing, and no hope of getting anything. And then I found what you'd left behind, and everything changed." Sarah sat back on her heels. "I hope wherever you are, you know that your sacrifice meant something, that you didn't suffer in vain. Your truth came out. Justice, even if it took a century. That has to count for something." She stayed for a while longer, sitting in the grass beside the grave of a man she'd never met, but who'd changed her life. When she finally left, she felt lighter somehow, as if a debt had been paid, a circle closed. Scene: the Foundation's first anniversary. 1 year after the discovery, the Martinez Family Foundation held its first anniversary celebration. They'd rented a ballroom in downtown Greenfield, invited everyone who'd been helped by the foundation, everyone who'd contributed to making it work, and Sarah stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. Jennifer Ochoa came with Miguel, who'd finished his treatments and was already starting to grow his hair back. A dozen single mothers who'd received rent assistance and job training. 3 families who'd been helped with medical bills. 20 students who'd received educational scholarships. Emma moved through the crowd like a tiny hostess, telling everyone about the programs her mom had started, about the community center that would open next month in Station Number 9, about the plans to expand to 3 more cities next year. Marcus Webb came, looking proud and emotional. "You did it right," he told Sarah. Harold researched that money for years but never thought beyond claiming it. You claimed it and then gave it back to the world. And that's rare. Patricia was there with her family, introducing Sarah to her daughter, who was considering law school. "You're the reason," Patricia's daughter said, "watching my mom help you fight for what was yours. That made me want to be that kind of lawyer, the kind who fights for people, not just money." James Hendrick had flown in from Oregon, bringing his entire extended family. "We've decided to create a scholarship in my grandfather's name," he told Sarah, "for children of military families who faced injustice or hardship. We can't bring him back, but we can make sure his name stands for something good." Daniel Reeves was there too, working on a book about the case. "I've been a journalist for 23 years, he told Sarah. "I've covered wars, political scandals, corporate corruption. But this story, this one matters more than any of them, because it proves that truth doesn't have an expiration date, that justice delayed isn't always justice denied, that sometimes the good guys actually win." Laura came late, slipping in near the back. She'd been distant since the discovery, struggling with jealousy and old sibling resentments. But she'd come tonight, and when Sarah saw her, she crossed the room immediately. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said. "I'm sorry," Laura said abruptly. "I've been awful. I was jealous and bitter, and I said terrible things about you to Mom and to anyone who'd listen. I told myself you didn't deserve it, that it was just luck, that you'd waste it, or ruin it, somehow. But watching what you've done with the money, with the foundation," her voice broke. "You're a better person than I am, than I'll ever be." Sarah pulled her sister into a hug. "You're here now, that's what matters. And Laura, I'm going to need help. The foundation is growing faster than I can manage. I need someone I trust to help run the education programs. Someone organized and smart and good with budgets." Laura pulled back, eyes wide. "You want me to work for the foundation?" "If you want to. Fair salary, challenging work, chance to help people. What do you think?" Laura's eyes filled with tears. "I think I'd like that. I think I'd like that very much." The evening ended with speeches. Patricia talked about the legal precedent the case had set. James Hendrick spoke about redemption and family honor. Several foundation beneficiaries shared their stories. Finally, Sarah took the microphone. "A year ago, I was about to be evicted, so I was working 3 jobs and still couldn't afford to live. When my grandfather left me that fire station, I thought it was his final insult, giving me a condemned building when what I needed was rent money. But it turned out to be the greatest gift anyone could have given me. Not because of the money I found there, though that changed everything, but because it taught me that sometimes the things that look worthless hold everything we need. Sometimes the places everyone else has abandoned are exactly where we need to look. And sometimes hope is buried so deep that we have to climb down into darkness to find it. But it's there. It's always there. We just have to be brave enough to reach for it." The applause was thunderous. As Sarah stepped off the small stage, Emma ran up and hugged her waist. "That was a good speech. Mom." "You think so?" "Yeah. But can we get ice cream on the way home? All this serious talk makes me want ice cream." Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Yes, sweetheart. We can definitely get ice cream." As they drove home later, ice cream cones dripping in the summer heat, Sarah looked at her daughter in the rearview mirror and thought about everything that had changed in 1 year. The money. Yes. The security. The foundation. The house. The future that stretched ahead bright and certain. But more than that, she'd changed. Somewhere between finding the gold in that hidden chamber and standing on a stage telling her story to hundreds of people, Sarah had transformed from someone who simply survived into someone who thrived. From someone who accepted what she was given into someone who fought for what she deserved. From someone drowning in desperation into someone who could extend a hand to others still struggling to breathe. The fire station had given her gold, but the real treasure had been discovering what she was capable of when she refused to give up. And that, Sarah thought, as they pulled into the driveway of their house, their real house, the one they owned, the one no landlord could take away, that was worth more than any fortune could ever be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.